Good afternoon. I am Stuart Saft, the practice group leader of Holland Knight's New York real estate practice. And today we are presenting a webinar on adaptive reuse of real estate. There have been a great many reports in newspapers about the excess of office space and the limited amount of residential space in the last couple of months, certainly coming since the end of the pandemic. And one of the solutions that have been discussed would be converting office space to residential space, which is what we plan on discussing today. Robert Kennedy said, "Some men see things as they are and say, why? I dream of things that never were and say, why not?" And I've always loved that quote because it sums up exactly what it is we should be doing. Adaptive reuse refers to modifying an existing structure to achieve maximum use and economic viability. This also means adapting the property's purpose for a function entirely different than for which it was originally created. As available development space and resources diminish, adaptive reuse will become an increasingly important trend, particularly in metropolitan areas. This is very true in our current post-pandemic environment, where we have an excess of office space and a dearth of residential space. Commercial, office, retail, and industrial warehouse space in our country contains 32 billion square feet of real estate. And the amount of undeveloped real estate remaining is continuously shrinking. As available resources diminish, property developers will be turning to adaptive reuse projects as a solution because it offers financial, sustainability, and cultural benefits to society. It's faster and less expensive to convert an existing structure into a new use than demolishing a structure and building something else. It also puts less strain on the environment by reducing the need to extract natural resources to build a new building, and it also preserves embodied carbon and energy in existing buildings. It also benefits cities because it enables the cities to save money and make the environment much better for their residents. Today, we are presenting the first in a series of monthly real estate webinars exploring the dynamic use of real estate in our changing economy. Real estate may be a hard asset, but it can be very flexible. As I said, today we'll be discussing converting office space to residential space. I am joined by my partner, Ken Lowenstein, who will be discussing zoning and land use issues, and experienced architect, Mark Ginsberg, who will discuss the architectural barriers in converting office space to residential use. My partner, Renee Covitt, and I will be describing some of the projects that we have completed and the legal issues that were presented in doing so. But before we begin, I want to thank Joe Gay, the real estate section leader, Damian Cohn, Holland Knight's Chief Marketing Officer, Mike Haig, Lauren Faulkner, and Kayla Thompson for all of their assistance in putting these programs together. So let me turn the screen over to Ken Lowenstein.
Good afternoon. I'm not Stuart Saft. I'm Ken Lowenstein. We're having some technical difficulties with my login. It's probably my fault. But in any event, as Stuart mentioned, I'm in New York City. I'm a New York City zoning and land use specialist. We are going to focus, I think, almost entirely on New York City today. At least I am, and Mark is, because that is our expertise. And obviously, every city has its own zoning rules and requirements. But with that, as Stuart was saying, there are a lot of benefits to conversion. A lot of cities or states see that it's a problem they have to start thinking about for all the obvious reasons, mostly caused by the COVID-19 situation and the new uses and dynamics regarding office use and occupancy. It's certainly become a very trendy conversation and topic. We know New York City's office space is struggling. The Times just yesterday ran another one of their regular articles about the New York City office market and its bleak outlook. As we will discuss, the states seems not to, the legislatures at least, seems not to care about these problems right now, and have rejected every proposal to try to make the rules a little easier and more and assist in these conversions. But we'll get to that in a few minutes. In contrast, I just want to mention, other cities, states, Chicago has a program of financial incentives to assist the conversion of buildings on LaSalle Street. California actually has a $400 million incentive program that they announced to assist conversions. Washington, D.C. amended its zoning already to assist conversions and expand the areas where conversions were allowed. But as we said, New York State has not changed anything in New York City. Manhattan has approximately 450 million square feet of office space. The city planning study recently estimated that about 196, just under 200 million square feet, is eligible for conversion, in that it under what we'll discuss later are the more flexible rules that exist under the zoning. So 200 million square feet, there are reasonably flexible rules that allow the conversion, and that would allow this 196 million. At the same time, Moody's has estimated that only 3% of the office stock is actually suitable for conversions because of many of the problems that we will discuss. There are conversions happening right now. 55 Broad Street is being converted by Silverstein. The GFP Real Estate is planning to convert 25 Water Street, which would be, it's a 1.1 million square foot building built in the 60s, and it will have over 1,300 units in it. So that's a very ambitious conversion project. But there are conversions happening, and I'm sure there'll be a lot more as we go forward. My role is to explain the sort of basic zoning rules and limitations, restrictions on these conversions. I'll also touch briefly on the tax-exempt property tax issues on conversions. And then I'll let Mark talk about the building code, multiple dwelling law, and practical problems that he's very familiar with. So in New York City, conversions are governed by 3 different laws. There's New York City zoning resolution, the New York City building code, and the New York State multiple dwelling law. The zoning law is what as I just said, is what I will talk about. Can we have the next chart, Lauren? So this is a chart, a flow chart, that is intended to give everybody an idea of how to approach this subject and what questions to ask. So on the far left, the first question is what zoning district you're in. And you have to be in a district that allows residential use. That seems pretty obvious. Those are basically C1 to C6 districts and what are called mixed use to MX districts. And there are if you're in a residential zone, unless you meets very strict standards, you're not going to convert to an office. Your office building you can convert, but there are not many office buildings in residential zones, so that's sort of irrelevant. If you're not in a district that allows residence use, you cannot convert as a right. And there's a possibility of getting a variance from the city's Board of Standards and Appeals, but it is a difficult process and complicated, and nothing we're going to talk about in this seminar. We're going to talk about what we in the zoning world call as a right conversions. So now we'll get a little more complicated. So in New York City, under the zoning resolution, there are different rules depending on where you're located and where a building is and when the building was constructed. And that's what the second box is intended to show. So that in Manhattan, if you're south of 59th Street, and with some exceptions that we can talk about if people are interested, and you built prior to 1961, let me back up. This box will show you the buildings that are eligible, shows the buildings that are eligible to use these more flexible regulations that we'll talk about next. So in order to use these more flexible regulations, if you're in Manhattan, south of 59th Street and built prior to 12/15/61, or in Manhattan, south of Murray Street and built prior to 11/97, those categories can use these most flexible regulations. And that's obviously most of the, certainly the Manhattan office stock. But in addition, there are other neighborhoods outside of Manhattan that are also able to use these more flexible regulations. There are obviously fewer office buildings in these neighborhoods, but they do exist. And just briefly, there's Brooklyn, Greenpoint, Williamsburg, Fort Greene, Brooklyn Heights, Park Slope, Carroll Gardens, and Crown Heights, and Queens, Astoria, and Woodside. And then there's Coney Island, St. George, and downtown Jamaica. Again, these buildings, depending on when they were built, they can use these more flexible regulations. But let's just concentrate on Manhattan because that sort of makes it simpler. So what are these more flexible regulations? Well, again, Mark will go into it in more detail than I'm going to go into. But what they do, and what the zoning resolution says is that if you're in one of these areas, they can use what's called Article 1, Chapter 5. And anybody who deals with conversions will get to know that term very well. And Article 1, Chapter 5 in the zoning resolution has a series of more liberal regulations regarding the amount of floor area that can be converted, the number of units that can be converted, and the location of residential units. So, for example, normally you cannot have residential units in the same building as a commercial use. The residential units have to be below the commercial uses. But if it's Article 1, Chapter 5, that restriction doesn't apply. So that gives buildings the ability, if you're just converting a portion of a building, to do checkerboarding. It also has more liberal light and air regulations, which for these buildings are important. And again, Mark can go into that in more detail. The other important aspect of these regulations is that it allows the entire building to be converted. So if you're a building that's in a district that's has a floor area ratio, and I assume people know what that means, but it's the basic term mechanism the zoning resolution uses to regulate the bulk of a building. Let's say you're in a zone that has a 10 FAR, but it's an older building built prior to 1961 or 1977 in Lower Manhattan, and that building has more than 10 FAR, you can convert the entire building to residential. If that building was built, constructed under the 1968 building code. Now, otherwise, you're subject to it. You cannot convert more than 12 FAR of that building to residential. Now, I want to just step aside for a minute. I think most of the land use bar practitioners have thought up until a couple of months ago that, in fact, you can convert any building that was under Article 1, Chapter 5 in its entirety and exceed the 12 FAR limitation. But the city had recently came out with a study on conversions, and that panel concluded that only buildings built before 1968 could qualify to exceed the 12 FAR maximum. We're still running down this issue, to be honest, and if people contact me, we'll keep you up to date on that. But I mean, if the city did publish a document that states it's 1968 and if it has to be before 1968, and we have to assume there's some basis for that conclusion. But this is an interesting question that's come up recently. The Article 1, Chapter 5 also has a couple of limitations. However, first of all, conversions have to still outside of Manhattan, where there's no parking requirements, and other neighborhoods such as Long Island City, you have to provide the required amount of parking, so which can be very difficult, obviously, for conversion. So that's one problem, again, outside of Manhattan for these conversions. In addition, this Article 1, Chapter 5 requires that a significant portion of the roof has to be used for recreation, outdoor recreation space. And that, again, Mark may be addressing that in more detail, but it makes it, that could often be a serious problem because roofs have a lot of other items that are on the roof. It's a provision that is that there's some historical reasons, and it's really outdated now. Why is outdoor recreation space that much more desirable than indoor recreation space? Well, there are lots of problems with it. But that's what the rules say right now. Now, the city did, as I mentioned, have a panel that made a series of recommendations. The panel was headed by the chairman of city planning, Dan Garodnick. And the city was trying to loosen these regulations to allow any building to convert that was built prior to 12/31/1990. Wanted to remove this 12 MDR cap on FAR. Wanted to expand the air, but both those actions, let me just stop there. Those two actions require state legislation. And as you probably have seen in the newspaper, the legislature has said they're not interested in making those changes or any other change for that matter, relating to housing or conversions. So those two proposals are now, as of now, not going to happen, and the rules I just outlined remain in effect. Other actions are within the city's authority, so they can expand these list of areas I have in this flow chart to cover some other areas, and not, for example, downtown Flushing. There are not going to be a lot of buildings in those sort of areas, or 125th Street, but it's still something the city can do, and it's on the table for the city to change the zoning. Similarly, the city can eliminate these parking regulations for conversions or modify them, and can revise the recreation space requirements. And the city is looking at that. Any change to the zoning regulations have to go through the ULURP process. So none of this is going to happen overnight, but those at least do not require state legislation. Hopefully the city will get that done. I would just have a couple more minutes here. I just want to quickly talk about tax exemptions. So the last time the city had the city confronted the specter of vacant office buildings in the early 1990s after the recession in the late 80s. The vacancy rate in the city office buildings was about 15%. Lower Manhattan was over 20+%, and Class B and C buildings was even higher. And a panel, the city at that point, led by the city, both Giuliani and Dinkins, both proposed at that time, major changes to the zoning regulations, and it supported a tax exemption program called 421G. That program provided both an exemption for any increase in this value due to the conversions, and more importantly, it abated the existing taxes, which basically meant it wrote the taxes down on these buildings to zero. So to give you, that was a very deep program. It's an incentive program, and it incentivized, or incentivizes, people can argue about that, but over about 100 buildings with 12,800 units used the program. So it was very successful in Lower Manhattan. Just about every project that I'm familiar with in Lower Manhattan that has used that program. It's expired, it's no longer in existence. But it was a very successful program at the time. They also had no affordability requirement. Now that's not going to happen anymore. I think we all know that that's not a realistic possibility. And the governor did propose, as part of her housing proposals, an exemption program for conversions that would have allowed only an exemption, and only exempted up 50% of the AV increase for only 5 years, and required that 20% of the units be affordable at a weighted average of 70%. I think many of us felt that program was not economically viable and wouldn't work, but at least it was something. But the legislature didn't even pass that. So there's nothing in the cards right now on the exemption side. There's nothing in the cards right now on the changes to these existing regulations that I ran through. I don't like to end on a bleak note, but I don't think anybody can bet on the city, the legislature being willing to make changes in the near future. I guess sometimes they need to get things need to get a lot worse before they want to do anything, but we will see. And I will now turn it over to Mark, and maybe he'll be less bleak than I ended my presentation on. Mark?
Thank you, Ken. We can go to the next slide. And I'll be a little less bleak because at least city planning and the city of Yes is going to make a number of proposals that they expect to certify sometime in 9 to 12 months related to housing. They just released this week a number of proposals related to energy, which is making it easier to meet local law 97 and decarbonize. So just as an aside, the building on the left is the only project my firm did, which was PS 90, where we converted an abandoned public school into residential up in Northern Harlem. And to do that, we had to go to the Board of Standards and Appeals because it wasn't in a covered area. Next slide. So presuming if your zoning permits, if your building code permits, if you can vacate the building, and then if you can pencil it out so it actually makes sense, I'm going to talk largely about physical constraints. There are issues of light and air. And even if the code will allow something, so you have a window that's 10 feet away from the adjacent building, it may not be rentable, saleable in a market rate condition. Window facades, local law 97, and energy, which is going to be true of every building. When you convert it, there is an opportunity to upgrade the facade and go to an electric system. And then, are there residential amenities? And I'll just for a second point this out. I moved into Tribeca 33 years ago. At that point, there were very limited residential amenities as buildings were being converted from warehouses and largely warehouses to residential. And now it's full of amenities. As you'll hear about later, our office is at 55 Broad Street. A Whole Foods just opened 2 blocks away. The whole Broad Street, Wall Street area that is blocked off to traffic has become a dog run at the night, in the evening. And so typically once the residential units come, the support for the residential come. Next slide. So I want to make the point that old buildings are typically pretty easy to convert because before World War II, there wasn't the fluorescent light bulb. And because of that, you basically wanted all office space to be within 30 feet or less of a window. So because incandescent bulbs used a lot of electricity, created a lot of heat, and didn't necessarily give you enough lighting. So with the advent of the fluorescent light bulb and lighting fixture, we have been able to go to things. On the right is the World Financial Center, which is a much bigger floor plate. What is somewhat misleading in the Woolworth building, on the lower floors, there is a courtyard behind the tower on the upper floors. So all of those went, that isn't a solid mass. Next slide. And I want to make the point that the Empire State Building conceptually would be a very easy building to convert because it was built late 29 to 30 or 31. It's actually built, the building was erected in 10 months, which is pretty amazing. But it's just not very deep from the window. So you could convert this to residential if you could deal with a lot of other issues and make it work quite well. Next slide. And I'd point out that a few weeks ago, there was a good article in the New York Times. So on the right is a older residential building, older commercial building pre-World War II. And on the left was a modern glass office building. And they were pointing out how it was much easier to convert the old building. Next slide. So again, if an old building was 60 to 70 feet wide and you have a corridor and a core with elevators and stairs, you can have 30-foot deep units. And basically in New York City, habitable rooms have to be within 30 feet of a window. They also need to have 10% of the floor area as glass and 5% operable. So when I get to a 100-foot deep building, I create, there's this donut or this gray area here in the middle, which I can't really convert because my corridor, elevator, stairs is not going to take it up. I could put in a laundry room, I could put in a recreation space, but those are not necessarily money generating items. So what do you do? Next slide, please. So hit return again. You can create a light well, which is a court which would need to be 30 by 40 that you cut into the building, and you create additional windows, exterior space. There are some, that will solve the problem. There are some downsides. You lose floor area unless you can move it up. And then sometimes you're allowed to relocate the floor area. And that becomes a zoning issue. It's costly, and the structure has to make it work. So next, hit return again. The other option is when the Lower Manhattan rezoning happened, and I was actually on an advisory committee for that. The city made home office space more flexible, allowing more people, etc. Office space does not require a window. So you could use that inner part of the donut for office space that was connected to the apartment. And there are limitations. I think it is 5 employees. But there are other things. And at that point, I said, well, why don't we do this for all residential buildings? And it was pointed out that when people rent or buy an apartment, they don't expect the messenger service to be showing up every hour to pick up graphics or to drop off paper or whatever. Now, that may be less of an issue in our digital virtual world. It may not appeal to people, although I think with the pandemic, we have more remote work. And so having a office space in your home may be more appealing. And it may be used illegally for residential use. And what's interesting with that is another member of the committee I was on, I did a lot of work in Saudi Arabia, and he said there they build buildings and they can either be residential or commercial, and they prefer bedrooms without windows because the light is so blinding. So it's just a cultural perception, or there are reasons, and if you don't have proper mechanical ventilation, but I'm not sure it's the end of the world, is I guess my point, but it is illegal. Next slide. So this brings me to 55 Broad Street. And our office is in 55 Broad Street. And as Ken mentioned, Silverstein is buying the building from Ruding to convert it to office space. And we just signed a lease, and we will be moving out in about 5 months, which is too bad because we only moved in 3 years ago, and it's a very nice building. But there are some issues. Please hit return again. The lower floor plate is really deep. So they're going to have very thin, deep units. They may be doing some home office space. The middle floors are somewhat deep, which is where we are, and we've seen some plans, and they're just going to be very deep, narrow units where you basically walk by the kitchens and bathrooms before you can get to the living room. The tower portion is going to be quite good because it's shallower. But there is a whole other issue, hit return again, which is our core right now, and you can see this on the ground floor where there are elevators on both sides because some only go to the upper level. We have about a 10-foot wide hallway between 2 elevator banks. And unless you're going to demolish some of the elevator bank, and there's also a fire stair, you've got a lot of wasted space because there's really no way, if you've got multiple apartments at both ends, to make this narrower. And so you're going to have issues of inefficiency. So just to follow up on a few things Ken said, local law 97 is coming. Most of these buildings are going to require a new facade to meet the energy codes, or but that would be the case even if it was an office building. And if you're converting it, you have the opportunity to change the facades. Also, the all glass facades don't necessarily work well with putting walls to make bedrooms and living rooms in proportion. As Ken said, there is the recreation space issue. I know that the first part of City of Yes is a sustainable zoning that came out this week of 140 pages, and I haven't read through all of it, but I know they're going to be more flexible on rooftop recreation space because we're going to need to put more condensers up there to electrify. The City of Yes residential proposal is going to have significant reductions in parking requirements. In Manhattan, south of 96th Street, there are no parking requirements, but there are in lots of other parts of the city. And obviously, actually 55 Broad Street has a garage, so if you needed to meet parking requirements, you could. But and I think the city is going to propose pretty strong changes to resolve as much as they can without the state, but it does have to go through the city council. And I would suggest that it will be in all of our interests to support the proposals. And with that, I can answer questions or so on, or if you have for me or Ken or anyone else.
Well, Mark, at the present time, there are no questions in the Q&A and nothing in the chat room. But can you give us a broad likelihood of there being a great many conversions in Manhattan over the next 24 months or 36 months?
Well, I
Just
think
fleeting.
in lower Manhattan, you're still seeing conversions. A lot of them happened after the Trade Center with Liberty bonds, as well as the tax breaks that Ken talked about. My understanding is that without 421A, the conversions are likely to be to condos, not rentals. Lower Manhattan is easier, but you can do it in Midtown. And there are other issues. For example, in our building, although it's probably 50% vacant by now, our lease gave us 12 months from when the deal closed, from notification, which can't happen till the deal closes. So we actually, because we're moving to another Rudin building, move faster because they're going to start construction on all the vacant space while we could legally be still in here. And so it's probably going to take some time to vacate buildings if you're doing it. But I know Silverstein just set up $1 billion fund for conversions now and is paying $180 million for 55 Broad Street before they pay for the conversion. So I think it's going to happen, particularly in B and C buildings. The brokers I know and I've talked to, A buildings are doing fairly well, and B and C buildings, technically 55 Broad is a B building, have tremendous vacancies. And it also becomes a question that I don't fully have a crystal ball of how much remote work there's going to be. There's clearly going to be more than pre-pandemic, but slowly, as one can see, the MTA broke 3 million people riding in a day. Normally, before the pandemic, it was 5, but they're slowly inching up. So exactly how much is there. I'm giving a long answer to say there are a lot of factors and I don't really know, but I would expect to see conversions at least in Lower Manhattan and maybe some of the older buildings in Midtown. And then if the zoning changes that the city's talking about happen, as Ken indicated, it would expand hopefully the 12 FAR to, I think it's 77, that there'll be more.
Mark, we have a question. What is DOB's position on home offices that are likely to be used as a bedroom?
Well, let me answer this a few ways. And we haven't done a home office and a conversion, so I haven't had to deal with DOB. But if you have a plan that complies with zoning, they will allow it to happen. If somebody complains that someone is illegally using their home as an office, DOB may send an inspector. And if it doesn't, and if they are, they will issue a violation. And if it's a condo, it would be to the condo owner. If it's a rental, it would be to the building owner. But, and this is, DOB is only likely to do that if someone complains, because they don't go around checking every apartment in a building unless they have a complaint. So I'm not saying one wants to encourage it, but if it happens, and it may be happening in Lower Manhattan, and people don't know about it until someone complains, DOB isn't going to show up.
Thank you. That's very interesting. For the general audience, we will be taking questions and answers using the Q&A after we finish with the presentations. My involvement with adaptive reuse goes back a very long time to before anyone heard of the phrase adaptive reuse. I was a fifth-year associate, which was early in the modern age of real estate practice, where real estate has become an extension of finance. When a client was referred to me and he walked into my office and he was wearing a trench coat and a cowboy hat, and I figured, oh my God, I'm in trouble. And we started talking. His name was Tony Goldman, and I didn't realize it initially, but he was a visionary. And he sat there in my office discussing with me this idea he had of going into Soho and taking warehouse buildings and small office buildings and leaving them in place and then reconfiguring the buildings to make them residential. And I spent several years working with Tony in which we did exactly that. He was the individual who realized what Soho could become, and buildings on Green Street and Spring Street throughout the Soho area, Tony reimagined, and the buildings started out to a large extent, containing people who had just gotten out of school, and suddenly we found ourselves representing artists or I found myself representing artists who saw these old buildings with expansive light and quiet they needed, and we began to buy these buildings that were office and warehouse buildings and turning them into loft buildings for the artists. Over time, of course, Soho being Soho, the artists were making more money by owning these buildings that had become chic than they were for selling art. At a certain point in time, Tony decided to take a vacation and went down to Florida. And he came back and he said to me, I found an area in Miami that I think is perfect for redevelopment. And he basically is the one who found South Beach and figured out what to do. He then, a decade later, went on to Philadelphia, where he did the Center City, the same concept of taking existing buildings and changing the use. Unfortunately, he died about a decade ago. But before he did, he was invited into Boston to look at the Boston Harbor area and see how it could be reconfigured. And it was just amazing. I was too young to realize how brilliant he was, but I loved the activity and the things that we did. And it really created an interest that I've always had in doing this. Years later, when the real estate industry and my practice was busy doing tax shelters, we were always looking for something that could be redeveloped to generate excessive depreciation. One project was finding a burned out hotel in Long Beach, rebuilding it and turning it into an apartment house. Another time, a client found a property in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, a series of small rooming houses that nobody wanted to live in, and we reconfigured them into a vertical interior mall right in the center of town. And it was just, it was like playing with an erector set, because we were able, each time we went to a different area or found a different property, what we could do with it. So it didn't end then. It's continued to the present. Renee and I have done literally a dozen, or actually a dozen Manhattan buildings, doing conversions from primarily office use to residential use. We did 40 Broad Street, which was office space, and turned it into residences. And the complexity there was the fact that there was a park that was supposed to be part of the property, which had disappeared. And as we were finishing the redevelopment of the building, all of a sudden we got a violation from the city, and we couldn't figure out what they were talking about. What park could it possibly be? Renee will tell the story of how we were able to ultimately resolve that, but it was just one of the mysterious things that you come across. One of the things that I want to point out, which I think is very relevant in this situation, is that many of the buildings in New York City, and particularly in Manhattan, and particularly in the center of the Manhattan and lowercase, or downtown, are overbuilt based upon the current zoning code. So you could have a building that is built out at 250,000 square feet because it was built before the 1960s when the zoning law went into effect. And the building based upon the current zoning law could only be perhaps 100,000 square feet or 150,000 square feet. If more than 75% of that building is demolished, you cannot rebuild to what it was before. You have to go to the new space, the new FAR that's permitted under the zoning code. So by doing an adaptive reuse of these buildings that are, for example, 250,000 square feet, but would have to be 150,000 square feet, you're keeping 100,000 square feet of available space to be able to build out. And that's something we always look at when we're looking at sites to consider to redo. Renee and I worked also on 25 Broad Street, another large office building that we converted, excuse me, to residential use. Probably one of the most interesting buildings that we worked on was the Woolworth building. because instead of our client at the time buying the entire building, think of the Woolworth building, century-old building, landmark with a landmark lobby. And our client was offered to buy the top third of the building, and the bottom 2/3 of the building would continue to be office space. And so we didn't just have to negotiate a purchase and sale agreement to acquire the top third. If we had just done a purchase and sale agreement, and the construction crew turns up the day after the closing, the owner of the bottom 2/3 of the building wouldn't have had to let them in. So while we were negotiating the purchase and sale agreement, we had to also negotiate a development agreement to give us the ability to reconfigure the building. And Mark, you mentioned before getting rid of elevators at 55 to enable the expansion or the change of the building. What we did was use 2 of the elevator shafts during the construction to get equipment up and debris out of the building. And then afterwards, they were converted into residential elevators. But so we had to imagine, as we're negotiating the agreement, how the build out was going to occur and what we were going to need to be able to accomplish it. And then how the residents who would be moving into the top third of the building would be able to function, deal with their everyday lives. One of the problems, a big problem with converting an office building to residential use, is office buildings have central bathrooms, and not necessarily the plumbing you need to have a bathroom in every apartment, multiple bathrooms in every apartment, and that has to be taken into consideration. But we didn't just stop with the development agreement. We went on to also negotiate the condominium declaration that would be established because we needed to deal with the ongoing operation of a building that's partially residential and partially office. We just completed the conversion of 730 Fifth Avenue, the Crown Building, where I was on vacation, and I get a call from a client that they're buying the Crown Building for $1.8 billion, and I have to examine the documentation immediately. And suddenly, I have to take over the office space in this resort, going through all this paperwork and figuring out exactly how we were going to turn an office building on the corner of 57th Street and Fifth Avenue into residences. Then we had to negotiate an agreement with the partner who was going to own the retail space, with the purchaser of the upper portion of the building. Again, we had to do development agreements. We had to do an initial condominium declaration in order to permit each side to separately finance what they were doing. And then we spent a ridiculous amount of time with floor plans, making sure the pieces of each section, because ultimately it broke into 4 sections. There's a jazz club in the basement, a retail on the first floor, a hotel on the next 10 floors, and not just a hotel, but an Amman luxury resort. And then on the top 14, 15 floors, the residences. And it involved pulling out an entire bank of elevators, changing basically the front of the building, because you have to figure out how everybody's coming in and going out. An enormous amount of work, and then actually going through the process, not only of negotiating the purchase and sale agreement, development agreement, the condominium documents, working with the architect who's going to configure all of this, making sure everything was consistent. And then as the construction began and we figured we're home free, everything, we've covered every single contingency. There's nothing that we didn't think about. What we didn't think about is the fact that Donald Trump was going to run for president of the United States. Now, I know a lot of people didn't spend time thinking about that, but in turning the Crown Building into an Amman resort and residences, we didn't think about the fact that Trump Tower was directly across Fifth Avenue from our building. And just as we were about to start the demolition of all the office space, Donald Trump was elected president of the United States. The Secret Service jumped in, the FBI jumped in and closed all the streets. Now, we knew we couldn't bring the construction vehicles onto 57th Street. We couldn't put them on Fifth Avenue. So all of our planning in terms of building out the building was in utilizing 56th Street, which also happens to be the entrance to the residences at Trump Tower. Fortunately, we were able to negotiate an understanding and a deal with the Secret Service and the FBI to facilitate our being able to do this very complex construction. But we also had to get the consent of all of the lenders that we had negotiated with, both the senior debt lenders and the mezz debt lenders, in order to get the building completed. Ultimately, it was completed and life could go on. We did another Midtown Manhattan building we did was 685 Fifth Avenue. Same thing. The bottom of the building was remaining retail. The upper portion of the building is being turned into a Mandarin Oriental residences, not connected to a hotel. But here, the zoning opportunity was the reverse of what I mentioned earlier, because what I mentioned earlier was the fact that you want to save the portion of the building that exceeds what the current zoning status allows. What we had at 685 was the advantage of finding unused FAR. So we were able to take the existing office building, not change the facade, but add additional floors onto the top of the building, and it worked out very well. 212 Fifth Avenue was a warehouse and an office building on Madison Square Park that our client purchased. Fortunately for us, they purchased the entire building, so we had more flexibility, but we still had to negotiate agreements with the city for the use of the space as well as the build out. We've also found that this idea of adaptive reuse has worked for other than conversions of office buildings to residential. We did a Sears, a large 400,000 square foot Sears store in a mall on Long Island, where we turned it into a clinic for Stony Brook University Hospital, where they have all of this space in a mall environment to use for outpatient care. We did the same thing using a mattress firm warehouse and distribution center to turn that into outpatient services for Mount Sinai. And certainly throughout New York City, we've been doing parts of office buildings and turning them into charter schools, homeless shelters, all manner of other things. So this idea of utilizing additional structures in order to get the flexibility to modernize them, improve the sustainability, because as Mark and Ken pointed out, the buildings that work best for this are buildings that were built before the 1970s, but those are the buildings that need the most help in complying with local law 97, becoming more energy efficient, and all the things that we now concern ourselves with. But this is a way of accomplishing it without having to go through the process of demolishing a building, putting in building a new building, and using scarce resources to duplicate what's already there. Let me stop at this point and let Renee speak.
Thank you, Stuart. Just to elaborate on a few things that Stuart was saying, when I was a first year, one of the first condo conversions that I worked on was a Tony Goldman conversion. And, it was a few years after Stuart was a fifth year associate. But by the time I was a first year, we were still doing that. And I became an expert on joint living and working conditions for artists. And we had to figure out how to, convert condos and still, abide by joint living and working quarters policies for artists. So that was how I started my career. And as Stuart mentioned, I was involved in the Woolworth building, and I had a note circled on my notes that said elevators, because I don't think I've ever talked about elevators for as long as I did when we were negotiating that development agreement. And when we came up with the idea of hoisting everything through the two elevators, it was the most creative thing that anyone in the room had heard, because we couldn't figure out how we were going to do work on the top third of the building while there were actual retail tenants below. And I think that, especially in New York City, that's something really to consider, is that when you're doing this adaptive reuse, there are most likely going to be tenants with leases on the bottom floors of the building. And you have to figure out how you're actually going to construct the top of the building to do these residences and not disrupt what was going on. So not only were there elevators, but there were sidewalk bridges and scaffolding, and everything was a really intense negotiation as to not disturb the in and out everyday life of the tenants and downstairs. So I think that most of these conversions are going to involve those development agreements and condominium declarations that will preserve the life of the retail tenants while you're doing it. And I think, going back to what Mark said, with 421A and just the way that, with violations, I think all signs do point to condo conversions as opposed to residential, as opposed to rental. And so the condo declaration is something that is, really important too, because as Stuart had said, that's the life of the building. And that's how the residents and the retail tenants and the office tenants are going to live together once the building is actually constructed. I'm just trying to think if there was anything else I wanted to add to what Stuart said. In terms of the crown building, we don't have a picture of it, but the top of it obviously looks like a crown. And I think that there were rumors that that's where Imelda Marcus used to store her shoes. And now it's actually part of somebody's apartment. So there's I don't know if it's 4 floors or 5 floors of an apartment, and the very top of it is actually the crown. So it's a very interesting concept. And I had the building plans laying around in my house because we were negotiating this during COVID. And my 9-year-old daughter thought that the plans were so cool that she made me keep them, because she had never seen a building that had an apartment that had a crown at the top of it. But, in New York, there's just so many different opportunities, and you can be creative. And, when they built that, I don't think anyone ever thought that the crown would become the top floor of somebody's apartment. And now it is. So I think that that's really all I had to add. But
well, how did you, I know the answer to the question. How did you solve the problem of the park that we didn't know existed
I forgot
at
about
40
that.
Broad?
Well, you know the answer, and Ken knows the answer, because Stuart and I walked into Ken's office one day and said, "Ken, we need your help. We have this building and they're claiming that there's supposed to be a park there, and we have no record of there ever being a park." And Ken said, "Oh, well, I can help you." And he pulled out this book that listed every public park in New York City and turned to whatever page and found the building and said, oh yeah, here's the park right here. And Ken, you can tell us the name of the book because I don't remember, but our minds were blown. And apparently there is a book that shows where every public park in New York City is supposed to be, and Ken is the owner of said book.
It's truly an amazing experience. But all of these projects they all take on a life of their own. I don't think, and Renee, tell me if you disagree, I don't think we've ever done two projects that are identical, regardless of whether they're development. Probably the strangest one we've ever done was when we bought the land, the air rights, and the space from the door to create part of Broome Street. And you should mention the 400-page contract you negotiated and then closed on the door. And Ken just walked into my office. I hope he's no doubt here to comment, but describe the door situation.
How much time do we have left?
We have 13 minutes.
So our client wanted to build a building and bought air rights from, I think, 5 or 6 of his existing neighbors. And we did each deal individually and then put all the air rights together. And then right before we were about to proceed on the construction, they came to us and said, we think we need some more space and we don't like where the entrance to the building is going to be. And we made a deal with a not-for-profit next door, and we're going to purchase some of their space, which was actually an already existing condo, and we're going to move it over into our building, and we're going to build them a gym in the basement of our building. So it was basically a swap where we had to sever part of their condo, move it into our to-be-built condo, build the building, and then build a gym for them that was completely off limits to the rest of the building and didn't share any expenses or anything like that with the rest of the building. And so that, I think the negotiation of that agreement alone took a year before we were even ready to do anything or start construction or anything like that.
Yeah, and then you had to develop a tunnel to get from their building to our building.
Right. And we had to close on each piece individually. So every few months or so, there would be another closing and an exchange of, something, property for money or air rights or vice versa.
Ken, did you want to add something in?
No.
Renee told the story of your book that you found on your desk.
Nothing to add.
Oh, okay. Okay, Ken has nothing to add, but it was a tremendous benefit to us because we had gotten this violation from the city, which stopped everything. And we couldn't figure out what they're talking about because the building, 40 Broad, sits on New Street. New Street is probably as wide as my office and not very passable. And apparently at some point in the distant past, there was a park on New Street, which nobody really realized was a park. And at some point, somebody demolished it. And so we ultimately had to settle with the city to put in a new park. And there's no question about the fact that the new park was probably significantly more expensive than whatever the original park was, which was probably 2 bushes and a bench. So we had to do much better than that. Mark, I see you've signed back on. Is there something you'd like to add?
No, I was always here. I don't know what happened. My video went off, but I'm here. Nothing really to add. But I think your point that every building is different is very much the case. And how you deal with those differences can take up a lot of time.
Thank you. Well, if anyone has any questions or comments, don't hesitate to email us. We're happy to answer them. as you can tell, we really love what we do and have a lot of fun doing it. And it's not surprising because we're surrounded by a great team of lawyers. And you've got to meet Ken and Renee and our friend Mark. And this is pretty much what we do. So if you have any questions about something you think is next to impossible and you just want to make sure, don't hesitate to give us a call because we frequently will figure out how to get it done. Thank you all and have a great day. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.